Welcome back to CrimsonCast. Galen Clavio, Scott Caulfield, back at you once again. We were with you last week, and man, you folks chipped right in, had a bunch of interesting questions and comments, and we really appreciated that. So we're back to tackle stuff that we missed last week and to also tackle some new questions that have popped up this week. Scott, welcome back, and how's the week treated you so far?
Pretty good up until this weekend. I got hit. There's something going around up here. I got hit with a temperature I've never had, like just temperature, no other symptoms. I was hitting 103 this weekend. I was in a rough spot, but besides that, pretty good.
You're feeling better now. That's the important thing.
I'm feeling better now, and we apologize for the slight delay. We were having some issues.
We were having issues.
I mean, we're a team, man. The highs and the goods, for better or for worse.
I didn't marry you, Scott. I just started a podcast with you. Okay?
For Safari or Chrome. But it makes me wonder. Like, I restarted my computer, like logged into Safari, went into Chrome. Like, I've often wondered this, and it happened when I was trying to log into like an app on my TV, and I needed a code, and I had to go onto a Google website to verify it, and like, I don't understand. Like, I feel bad for like my dad, how he's able to traverse this world, because even for me, it's times where it's like a lot of like codes and verifications, this two-step verification. And it's like, I feel bad for the older generation dealing with this. Like, tech can be a pain anyway.
Yeah, I get you. I mean, I've given up trying to figure it out. I've found that you kind of, if you hew closely to whatever like if we're doing Google Hangouts, we'll probably need to use Chrome. If we're doing something with, Apple stuff, we probably need to use Safari. That's a good rule of thumb to go by.
Yeah.
Anyway, let's go ahead and jump right into it. We had some questions from last week, some questions from this week, and we'll probably have some more questions pop up here as time goes by. Again, we do appreciate everybody chiming in and asking questions. And I wanted to go ahead and start off by kind of wrapping up some of the football stuff from last week, and then we're going to talk basketball a little later. We're not going to go as long as we went last time. Last time we went a full 90 minutes. We'll probably be closer to 45 minutes on this one. So let's just let's jump in a little bit here.
You say that 90 minutes before we finish our podcast.
I know. I refuse to do it this time. But IU Artifacts asked, how do you feel IU football can best honor Bill Mallory's legacy long term? So, of course, Coach Mallory, most successful coach in IU football history, of course, passed away, sadly, during the offseason. And, IU's got this longstanding tradition where they don't name buildings or do anything like that after people that are still alive. Pretty good policy. But, it is a question that needs to be asked. I mean, if there's one person in IU football history that really deserves, to have some kind of permanent long-term recognition, it's Bill Mallory. But it's tough because, you don't want to name stadiums after people generally, particularly since Memorial Stadium is named in honor of the soldiers from prior wars, and it's tough naming individual parts. You're not going to name the field, really. That's a little bit kind of I think a cheap way out of things. What would your suggestion be on this front?
I think you just keep him in the I'm a Hoosier montage. Like, that's good enough. Just I'm a Hoosier. Come on, no laugh. No.
That's it.
No. I mean, honestly, you're right, but yet they did. I'm not saying they shouldn't have, but they did name. You have Heps Rock at the north end of the field. I actually think there's an easy solution to this. You're just finishing the south end of the field. There's a lot of naming opportunities there where you could have like an atrium or the entrance. It could be like called the Mallory Atrium or the Mallory Entrance. And again, I've heard from the like varsity club and some of the athletic areas that they're trying to build like a gathering place or some kind of like the donor gave some money for kind of I don't want to say a fountain, but some kind of gathering place on that south area in front of the stadium. And so I think maybe naming that after him, but I think like an atrium or an entrance or something along that lines in the south area that just got finished, to me seems like the best idea. Cause I'm like you, I think, Bill Mallory is obviously the most important coach the most important coach, the most successful coach IU football has had. But naming the field after him, it's kind of a permanent decision, and I'm not sure we want to go down that road. Like you said, we can't Memorial Stadium has a good name. So that would be my answer.
Yeah, no, and it's like, I mean, the court at Assembly Hall is named Branch McCracken Court, yet not many people know that. It's more apocrypha than like a permanent element of Assembly Hall.
It doesn't say it on there anywhere. And by the way, let Dick Vitale know that, because every time he's here, he bitches about how we don't call it Robert, Knight Court. It's like, because it's already named McCracken Court, Dick.
Right. And the other issue, I think, and actually the field thing was something that was recommended. Brian Tonsani recommended that in Twitter, but said there were pluses and minuses to it. Joel suggested could name Tailgate Park Bill Mallory Park. That's not a terrible idea. But yeah, it's tricky because it becomes, I think, more and more difficult, unless you're willing to kind of go out of your way to, name a field or a court or something to honor a prior coach. I mean, it's generally not a good idea, as we've seen with, say, Penn State, for instance, to put statues up of people that you never can predict what's going to be said about people, or maybe things become uncovered. Not that I'm implying anything at all with Coach Mallory on that, but that sort of a scenario has tended to make schools relatively gun shy about erecting statues for people. But that might not be the worst idea. I mean, I think we've kind of got past the statute of limitations with anything that might possibly be said about Bill Mallory. It's almost all uniformly positive, and I don't anticipate anything being different there. So maybe that's the answer. Or, and particularly since IU was fine with erecting those statues in the lobby of Assembly Hall of Branch McCracken and Bill Garrett and Steve Alford and that whole crew. That might be the route that they end up taking. But it's something
you could rope in other people too. I mean, you could do kind of like how a lot of football teams, the NFL teams have, is like a ring of honor where you have just a lot of names around the stadium.
I do like that idea.
Now that we have, then you could bring in guys like, Randall L., Anthony Thompson. You could add other greats on there as well.
Right. No, that's not a bad idea. I mean, I think anything where you're not just completely renaming something for the heck of it, and instead you're doing something where you're able to recognize other luminaries from IU history. It'd be interesting to see how they set that up, but I like that idea to some degree.
And the last thing I'll say, this is nothing at all against Mallory, but you do have this kind of, with, like you said, with the basketball court being named McCracken Court, you get into these odd situations where, Bob Knight won more games and won more national championships than McCracken, but it's like, once you name it McCracken Court, then it's kind of tough to pull his name off and put Knight's name on there. And, Mallory was the best we've had in the coaching realms, but in reality, like, we didn't go to a Rose Bowl with him. We didn't win a national title with him. I'm not saying that's bad, but it does, like, if you name the field after him, what happens if somebody comes in and starts like, we win 2 or 3, Big Ten titles?
Yeah, no, I mean, this is where it does get tricky, because you've got a very limited amount of real estate. So yeah, something external to the stadium, but something prominent, because I do think as the years go, by and by, you're going to have people who understand less and less the legacy of Bill Mallory and why it was so important, for a lot of the reasons that you just kind of, I think, inadvertently highlighted. Because someone could look at his record and say, well, we didn't go to a Rose Bowl, never won more than 8 games in a season. Like, what's the big deal? And that, unfortunately, if you're looking back at IU football history, you need to understand how important that era of IU football was, even though it, at the end of the day, didn't rise IU, permanently out of the muck, it showed that it was possible. Yeah. So anyway, some other questions that we had pop up, and most of these were relatively newer, but Patrick chimed in with several questions. And this is a little bit of a pickup of what we talked about last week on the quarterback situation. How many quarterbacks play in the game at Florida International? And this is really getting interesting. Like, I keep getting kind of surreptitious commentary from people talking about the quarterback battle. And what I'm hearing is Michael Penix looks really, really good. And, Brandon Dawkins is not very high on the depth chart. And I'm not sure exactly what the reasons are for any of that, but that seems to be where we're at. at this particular moment in time. So let's just tee this up. I'll start on this. I think they'll only play 2 quarterbacks at FIU, and I don't know which 2. This is one of those where I think they need to see. The primary things here are, can they just run all over FIU and therefore not have to do much in the passing game? I think if that's the case, then it's likely you would see Ramsey and Dawkins be the 2 that play. To some degree, you'd like to see Penix play, but I don't know that you would want to have Penix, regardless of how good he's playing in practice, playing in an opening game like this, not just because you want to have an opportunity for a player to just kind of sit back and watch, but also, since you've only got, if you want to try to redshirt Penix, you've only got 4 games in which to play him. You would hope that you would be able to take care of this particular team regardless of whether you play him or not. Now, I can get there's the arguments both ways here, but I think ultimately what will happen is that you'll only see 2 quarterbacks play in this. And I would imagine it's going to be the 2 players with more experience, because I would imagine that IU is going to be relatively vanilla in most of what they do as far as this game's concerned, unless they absolutely have to be something other than that.
I mean, there's an option they play 4. Maybe Johnny Paps gets some time.
No.
By the way, if we see him play, there will be a Paps Blue Ribbon announcer bring that up at some point. I think we're going to see all 3 of them play. I really do, because it seems like they really don't know who the starter is going to be. There's Brandon Dawkins seems to has the experience. Peyton Ramsey has the experience at Indiana, and Penix seems to be kind of the most talented, but as a true freshman. This is a great game where you can play Penix a little bit, get him a little bit of experience, but not blow the redshirt year. Yeah. And you can probably play him in some situations where it's not going to be as high profile or high pressure as like a Big Ten game. So I think you might see all 3, because hopefully we can get a nice kind of a pad of lead and then almost turn it, I don't want to say into a scrimmage, but turn it into a situation where we're able to try some things out, run some different things, and almost use this as I don't want to say practice, but use it as a way to kind of test these guys out. And so I think we're going to see all 3, because from what, like you said, from what we're hearing from camp, they have really no idea on where the depth chart is.
Patrick is in chat right now, and he mentions or asks the question: would Penix succeeding in his first game in Florida, his home state, help recruiting? I would guess no, but I've long since given up any sort of pretense that I understand what makes recruiting work and not work. So maybe it could have an effect. I think it would have less of an effect in this particular game because A, it's Florida International, and B, I think the game's on ESPN News. Is that?
It's on CBSS.
Sorry, CBS Sports Network. Which I think even fewer people get. So certainly it wouldn't hurt. In recruiting for a guy that was a red shirt, or not a red shirt, a true freshman to come in, play and win. That would be certainly a great story. I just don't know if it really moves the needle as far as overall recruiting, if it's done there versus it's done against Virginia. Like I would think, honestly, I think beating an ACC opponent, even if it's at home as opposed to being in the guy's home state, might have a little more juice as far as the recruiting's concerned. I don't know. I mean,
dude, I'm with you. I have no idea what moves the needle in recruiting. And
to some degree, I feel like what it's almost like you're in NCAA football 14. You're playing PlayStation. You can adjust the sliders by 5s, or you could adjust the sliders by like 1. And really, at the end of the day, like there's not much difference between like a slider at 72 or 73. I feel that way about this recruiting thing where, yeah, it might have like a 1% more positive impact, but probably not a whole lot more than that. And then if that's the case, you have to ask yourself whether it's even worth doing. Yeah. But again, we don't know. I mean, a lot of Allen's success in recruiting in Florida, a lot of that seems to come from his own knowledge of the state from having been at USF. And so, the fact that they're able to build on that is good. Who knows? He might know the scene much better, and I'm sure he'll make the appropriate call.
I would say that the corollary to this would be like if North Carolina State had a recruit from Indiana and they were playing Valpo, And if he had a good showing, would that give North Carolina State the ability to really target Indiana as a basketball recruiting hotbed? And I mean, in the football, everyone's hitting Florida. And we are so far down the pecking order. It's not like we're going to get suddenly a pipeline to Florida that's going to take it off. Like,
I mean, we've kind of got a pipeline to Florida, though. I mean, you look at the roster, and I mean, several players coming in next year out of Florida. So it does help. I don't know.
It has a ton of players coming out of them, too.
Yeah. Couple of other things from the chat. Brock Haggard asks, is there a hard deadline for redshirt designation? And Brock, and for anybody else who's not heard this, the NCAA actually changed the rule so that you can play a player up to 4 games at any point throughout the course of the season. And, so basically, no, there's no hard deadline as long as a player doesn't play in more than 4 games. And the snap number doesn't matter. Order of games doesn't matter, anything like that. So that's a positive if we might want to see Michael Penix out there on the field. Craig Overway chimes in and says, I don't think we'll see Penix at FIU unless Ramsey and Dawkins are really struggling. Why burn one of his 4 games to retain his red shirt unless he's really needed to win, which is basically where I'm at on this. I just think that, this is one of those games where you should be able to beat FIU with, a relatively competent golden retriever at quarterback. You probably don't need to burn one of the 4 games that counts towards the red shirt of a true freshman in this particular contest. So if you have to, as we've heard several people say, if you have to do X, Y, or Z in your IU, you've got much bigger problems at that point. So anyway, also Jared Morris for Assembly Call is in chat. He mentioned Bob Morris, his dad, former coach at IU, had a pipeline to Florida back in the day and Georgia. It's true. And, look, I mean, a lot of good players from IU over the course of the last 20, 30 years have come out of those 2 states. So it is important that we see those players do well to continue those things, I think. Let's see. A couple other questions, and then we'll move on to the basketball side of things. Another question from Patrick. Does IU have a 1,000-yard wide receiver or running back this year? That's a really interesting question, because if you look at IU over the course of the last several years and how the stats have played out, it's certainly not a foregone conclusion that you're going to get to that point, but they've either had people there or gotten close. So if you look at the running game, last year, no 1,000-yard rusher. The closest guy was Morgan Ellison, had 704 yards. But the previous year, Divine Redding rushed for over 1,100. The year before that, 2015, he had 2 players rush for over 1,000 yards, both Jordan Howard and then Divine Redding. And then, of course, the year before that, Tevin Coleman, 2,000 yards all by his lonesome. On the receiving front, last year, closest player to 1,000 yards was Simi Cobbs. He had 841. Nick Westbrook almost broke the 1,000-yard mark in 2016. He had 995. And then you have to go back to 2015 to find a player that had 1,000 yards receiving. It was Simi Cobbs that year. And then Ricky Jones came within 94 yards of it. Looking at the roster this year, I think my answer is yes. I think Morgan Ellison's going to rush for 1,000 yards. I think that the line sets up well for him. I think that, and again, it is completely dependent on, can he avoid injury? But I feel like the offense is going to be oriented more towards running the ball and trying to maintain possession and take time off the clock. And I think that that's going to give a guy like Ellison, who rushed for almost 5 yards a carry last year, lots of canvas to do that sort of work. And you figure over a 12-game season, provided he's healthy for the whole time, you're only talking about having to average, like 80 or 85 yards a game to get to 1,000. And so that I would feel relatively confident that Ellison's going to get to that. I don't think so on the receiving, just because I think there's enough options out there that they're going to spread the ball around. And, the idea that one guy is just going to be able to accrue that much yardage. I mean, obviously, if anybody's going to do it, it's going to be Westbrook, but Westbrook's going to be pretty heavily covered. And I get the sense there's going to be a lot of spreading of the ball around to try and, basically find whoever the open guy happens to be. We still don't know how this offense is going to look and, what the targeting process is going to be like on it. But I would guess yes on the rushing side, no on the receiving side.
Yeah, I concur that. I mean, I talked a lot about Morgan Ellison last week. I think for the exact things you mentioned, if you look at his yards per carry, it's up there. If you take out Tevin Coleman and Jordan Howard's years, he has one of the highest yards per carry in the last 15 years. So I think he's going to get more carries. I think he'll easily hit 1,000 yards. And it's interesting going through the statistics right here. You're always a good. I know you haven't looked at this yet, but you have Tevin Coleman in 2014 at 2,000 yards that season. Before that, do you know the last guy to get over 1,000 yards was?
Oh God,
it was a while. Like it's shocked me how long it was.
Was it Ben Jarvis Green Ellis?
No. It was LeVron Williams.
Oh, LeVron. Yeah, in 2001?
Yep, 1,400 yards, and Antoine Randall. Yeah, so 2002 to 2013, we didn't have anybody get over 1,000 yards.
It was such a desert in IU football history. It's really remarkable how – and really, they weren't even close. Like, you go back 08, Marcus Thigpen had 631 yards.
2006, Kellen Lewis, our leading rusher, with 441 yards. I mean, he's our quarterback.
2010 had to be the worst of the worst. I mean, Trey Burgess was the leading rusher that year. 352 yards, averaged 3.3 yards a carry.
It's possible that season Wisconsin had more rushing yards against us that year against us than we had all season.
I mean, that year, we're not going to dwell on this, but that year, IU as a team rushed for 1,204 yards. I mean, that's insane. Anyway, so that's we had a couple of comments off of that. Patrick saying, I love Ellison, but running back by committee prevents him from 1,000 yards. You have Guest and Majette and the freshman. That's certainly a possibility. But the one thing I'll say on the running back by committee thing is that, I really get the sense that IU is going to want to have a workhorse running back that they can consistently go to. I mean, even with the running back by committee stuff last year, Ellison had fully 50 more carries than the next closest running back. Yeah. And you go back another running back, it was Devontae, or no, I guess it would have been Mike Majette, had 22 carries, so they haven't gone to as much of the committee thing, at least in the 1 year sample that we've seen, as one might think. So it's something to keep an eye on, at least. Brian Tonsoni in chat, if Ellison gets 1,000 yards, IU will be successful. I think that might be one of the bellwether stats for this season. Because I think it says two things if Ellison gets 1,000 yards. A, it says that IU is obviously moving the ball enough that there's a guy that's able to consistently do that. And B, I think it says the passing game's good enough that the opposition isn't just clamping down on the running game and putting 8 or 9 guys in the box every time. So, that's the sort of thing I think that is important. And I get the sense that we'll see what occurs, early on in this year. As Patrick points out, Majette and Guest were both injured last year, which is true. But I think Ellison is a talented enough running back that even with the depth that's available, he's going to be getting most of his yards in the first 3 quarters of the game. And ideally, IU will be in a position where they don't necessarily have to play him, every single down in all of those. But if he's got the kind of burst that we saw a little bit of a glimpse of here and there last year, if he can rip off 20 or 30 yards a couple of times, I think that gets him a lot closer to that goal. So we'll just have to wait and see.
And I would say third thing of why it's a good sign if he gets over 1,000 yards is it means not only is the passing game working, but it means that our quarterbacks have time to throw. Ramsey last year had 226 yards. Though most of those weren't on design running plays. They were plays where the passing game broke down, his coverage or his line didn't hold up, and he had to scramble around. And so, that if those yards don't get eaten up by quarterbacks, it means that we're doing better.
Or and it also could mean that. The quarterbacks are doing some RPOs. They're keeping the ball themselves. I mean, as Brock Haggard points out in the chat, if Dawkins wins the quarterback job, he might end up being the second leading rusher, which is true. And even if it's Ramsey, or Penix, like any of the three, they should be able to run the ball. That should, open holes either for them or for the running back, because it's going to give the defense something else that they have to concentrate on. So something to keep in mind. Let's jump to the final new football question. Actually, we don't have another football question, so never mind. Any final thoughts on the football front here before we jump over to basketball from anybody, from you or anybody in chat.
No, I think we tapped out about as much football as I could do last week.
We did hit a lot of football last week, and I mean, there's more to talk about. I mean, we'll have at least one more football only podcast where we'll kind of lay out our predictions for the season and talk about how we think things are going to go game by game, because that's always a fun podcast. I love putting ourselves out there and then just constantly. We did have one question actually that I want to track down. I think it might be on the other Twitter account. Hold on one second. This is great radio. So thanks to all of you for sticking with us. But I can't find it. But basically, I think somebody. The question was basically, every year I am kind of a homer for IU football, and I pick us to win 7 or 8 games, and it's like not every year, but a lot of years I feel like I'm disappointed by what occurs. Like, what is the floor and the ceiling or something like that. I might be conflating two different questions, but I will say this. I do think that for people that are trying to pick what this team's going to do, it's really hard this year. There's absolutely this. We talked about this on the podcast last time around. Here it is from Matt Uhl. I'm always accused of being a crimson-colored glasses-wearing fan. Is it too optimistic to see a 7-win football team and an IU basketball team in the Sweet 16 if we get the right amount of luck this upcoming school year? So, no, it's not being too much of a crimson-colored fan. Like, I think those are – I don't know if I'd call them reasonable expectations, but they're not unreasonable expectations. Like, the idea that those two things could happen, that IU could win 7 games and obviously go to a bowl, and then also make the Sweet 16 in basketball. Yeah. And I'm not even sure that is the upper reaches best case scenario for either team individually. I think
let me just, I'll count it out with games that are winnable this year in football. You have FIU, Virginia, Ball State, Rutgers, Iowa, Minnesota, Maryland, Purdue. I mean, so that's 8 wins. If we can take care, I mean, what you're asking a lot for us to close out all the games we're supposed to close out, which you and I have been talking about this for years, and we've never done it over the time we've been doing it. But I saw that question too, and I liked it because I don't think it's, on first glance, I was like, basketball, yes, football, no way. But then when you look at it, it's like, it's not unreasonable. It's just asking us to win all the games. That's not us beating Ohio State, Penn State, Michigan, or Michigan State. If we can win all the rest of the games, which I think are all, under the category of winnable games, yeah, it's not unreasonable. I think we could have 7 or 8 wins.
Yeah, it's one of those deals where, things have to go right for both teams in order for that stuff to happen. And,
right.
There's just a lot of variability. I would argue it's easier for basketball to get to the Sweet 16 than it is for football to win 7 games. And I think that's a combination of talent and just the way that basketball versus football works. I mean, you get a good recruiting class, you get a star recruit like Romeo Langford in, and that can change fortunes very quickly. With football, it's a lot more incremental. I think there's a lot more question marks of a serious nature around football and what football is going to be able to do, whether they're going to really be able to, overcome the loss of starters on defense, where they're going to be able to figure out the quarterback situation, whether that's going to last throughout the course of the year. Those are big issues, and it's certainly not impossible. That's what makes this IU football season so difficult to predict. I mean, you could predict IU to win 7 or 8 games. You could predict IU to win 4 games. And I think you can make a very, very reasonable argument either way. As far as basketball is concerned, as we'll talk about here in a minute, I think the best of things is happening right now for IU basketball, which is the gift of relatively low media expectations. You're seeing predictions for IU being like 7th in the conference. You're seeing predictions for IU, maybe squeaking into the tournament as like a 9 or a 10 or an 11 seed from some bracketologists. You're not seeing people coming out and saying, wow, that IU team is like one of the top 2 or 3 teams in the conference. I think that's great. I mean, because it allows the coaching staff to play the nobody believes in us card. It also allows the players to kind of learn their roles, allows the freshmen to develop without the burden of high expectations. And I think that that's a really key component when you're talking about a basketball team that's obviously got a lot of talent, but is still going to be pretty raw as far as the college level is concerned. So let's go ahead and talk about some of those basketball questions that we got. We had a question from our buddy Jared Morris from Assembly Call from last time that I figured was worth trying to tackle. Let me track back and find that. So Jared had asked, where did it go? This is embarrassing. It was right there a second ago. Well, it was here we go. The question was, what position do you feel more confident about right now, quarterback or point guard? And TRP time, which I guess is trumpet time, IU fan, principal trumpet at the VSO asks or responded to that with, I think people are overlooking Al. I'm assuming he means Al Durham a little. He started at the point a lot last year and clearly has had a monster offseason. I think we're good at point with 3 guys. What are your thoughts on this? I guess first off, as far as those 2 positions, which one do you feel more confident in?
That's a really good question. I'm much more confident in point guard because I feel like Romeo could slide over and play point guard if we needed him to. I mean, he's better off as a shooting guard, but if Al's having a tough game, you could slide over and let Romeo play that. Like we just said at quarterback, Penix has looked good from what we heard. It's camp. He's a total redshirt freshman. He was not a 5-star, top 5 projected lottery pick coming in to IU. So the fact that you have 3, I think the old adage, you have 2 quarterbacks, you don't have any quarterbacks. And the fact that we have 3 quarterbacks, meaning we may not have any. So I would have to say I feel much more comfortable in our point guard situation. I like that question though.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would tend to agree. I think that the benefit for the basketball program is that they do have a guy in Al Durham who, while he had an up and down year last year, was fairly effective in what he did. I mean, he had a relatively decent assist rate. Certainly not as good as a Robert Johnson, but he was at least getting the ball around a little bit. He was able to score the ball. He had a net positive as far as his offensive rating was concerned. His shooting wasn't that great last year, but I think that'll come around. Obviously, Robert Finney comes in. He's going to be ready to go. And as you mentioned, you've got, you got Romeo Langford available to play, some point. You'll have other people that can handle the ball. And, while point guard's a very important position, I think that there's some time to learn and process things in the early going. And we're going to talk about the schedule in a minute here. But there's a little more runway for the point guard situation at IU versus quarterback, where they're really going to have to, we just talked about who's going to play in the FIU game. And once that FIU game's done, that's 1/12 of the season is over at that point. So I do think it's going to be a situation where, right now the point guard play for IU is, it's still a work in progress, obviously. And it's something where, you're going to lose a lot by not having Robert Johnson and even Josh Newkirk, who, while he struggled with large aspects of his game, still had a pretty overall decent assist rate last year. His big problem, frankly, was on the turnover side of things, but he did get the ball distributed. He was like 300, like somewhere around the 300 mark in the country. The other question is Devontae Green and what he does, how he handles his offseason, because that's a guy who had just a slightly worse assist rate than Josh Newkirk had. And, certainly he was a little hot and cold, seemed to be more in the mix as the season went along, towards the tail end. But it's really going to be interesting and see what occurs with all of that. Jared chiming in on the chat here for the video and says, I like Al a lot, but I'm getting the sense that IU fans are expecting a bit too much from him. He has a chance to be a very, very good role player, but I don't see him surpassing that this year. And that may be the case. This is, I think, the fascinating thing about this basketball team as a whole is you look at the roster, there's talent on the roster, there's a lot of youth on the roster, And there's not really a whole lot of defined roles that, it's going to take us a while as fans and media observers to get a sense of who's going to actually do what. We don't know who are the redshirt candidates at this point. We don't know if, you're going to see a situation where the freshmen are just going to come in and start playing immediately. You can feel fairly confident Juwan Morgan's going to start. You can feel fairly confident that Romeo Langford's going to start.
Not going to redshirt?
Yeah, I don't think they're going to redshirt him. And outside of that, I don't know if there's any foregone conclusions. We hear good things about Jerome Hunter. We hear good things about Justin Smith. It's very likely those guys would start, but we still don't know. We don't know about Deron Davis. We don't know, where does Zach McRoberts slot into things. There's just a lot of factors. And I don't think they're necessarily negative factors. It's just more of a curiosity factor. Like how will all of this play out? It's a mystery to me.
Well, I'll go even deeper on that. I mean, I'm not sure. Again, I like the question, but I'm not even sure we need a good point guard or we need a point guard at all with the way this team is constructed. Like as we talk about it, as we talk about expectations, I'll say this a lot of times leading up to the season, but I believe with Romeo and Juwan Morgan, we have 2 of the top 5 or 6 players in the Big Ten. And so we have a top guard and we have a top big man, and the rest can kind of flow in there. Like, basketball and the way basketball can be played now, it's kind of, positionless is used all the time. But you look at like the Warriors, like Steph Curry is their point guard, but he's not always bringing the ball up. He's not always moving everything around. We're basically going to have, like you said, a lot of guards and a lot of big men. To me, I feel comfortable if we don't have a great, quote unquote point guard. You're always going to have guys who can bring the ball up. If Durham's having a bad game, like you just mentioned, there's 5 or 6 other guys that can come into it. But, you always have a steady rock in that you have a Romeo, you have Juwan, you have a great big man, you have a great guard. The rest is kind of can kind of move around.
I don't know if I buy that. I really think that, this team needs a good distributor of the basketball because, having a good, a consistent scorer in Romeo Langford's important, but I don't think they want to have the ball in his hands all the time. I mean, I think, obviously he's going to have the ability to break people down off the dribble and that'll be helpful. But, what we've seen, I think, over the course of time as the college game has evolved is that if you're going to compete, you're going to need somebody that can get the ball, into positions that, a person handling the ball looking to score might not be able to do. And, I worry without a good ball distributor, without somebody that's able to just consistently get out there and make sure the ball gets where it's going to go, that the offense gets bogged down. I feel like that's what happened a lot at the beginning of really almost all the way through the first half of the season last year. And, you look at the struggles that Josh Newkirk had, you look at the struggles that Devontae Green had, and certainly Al Durham struggled as well, just kind of adapting to the college game. It created a scenario where, IU's offense really didn't work well. And, some things happened. Obviously, I think Newkirk kind of got his senses about him. I think that Devontae Green got better. Deron Davis not being in the lineup forced IU to have to play like a specific style of ball, and that ended up working out for them. But you've got riches on this team from the standpoint of, the personnel sets that you can throw out there. You've got a lot of variability. I'd hate to see a kind of a reductionist IU offense based upon the idea that there wasn't somebody out there that you could trust to distribute the basketball. And so that's something to keep an eye on, certainly moving forward. But all in all, going back to Jared's original question, I still feel more confident in what IU is going to be able to do at the point guard position. Again, because there's talent there and because they're going to have enough of a runway, I think, to figure things out relatively early on in the season.
And I have more trust in, and this is only because I'm so impressed with Archie Miller, I have more trust in the coaching ability on the basketball side than I do on the football side. Again, it's not a knock on Tom Allen. It's a plus for Archie Miller.
Well, yeah, and I think it's more, to me, it's not Tom Allen. It'd be more Mike DeBoard.
Yeah.
And, again, as we talked about last time, last year was a struggle because of how different the two quarterbacks were. And yet, it's funny, I was on Facebook I think it was yesterday, and a John Punt piece popped up from last year, And it talked about, Richard Lego looks like he's going to be the starter from day one. There's not going to be problems. And then, you get a game into the season and you're just like, I guess it was 5 quarters into the season. And it's like, well,
we have a problem.
We got problems. And so, I still, if there's a concern I have, and I mentioned this on the podcast last week, the board went into last season saying Richard Lego's our starter and then had to backtrack on that almost immediately. I do worry, like the fact that there's still indecisiveness as far as who the quarterback's going to be right now. Maybe that's a positive, but then it's almost one of those things where they have to make the decision and then you can be like, okay, yeah, they made the right decision. I need to see it happen before I get too excited about it. Some other comments and questions here. Let's see. We've got some comments in chat. So on the point guard front, Brian Tonsomi saying Finney is the key. Can he get acclimated to college ball quickly? He's a great distributor. And that I think really comes down to it. It's Finney's job.
Yeah.
Whether it's Finney's job on day one or whether it's Finney's job, at the end of his freshman year, I think that's how things are set up to be. Yogi Ferrell was able to come in and do a pretty good job right off the bat. Obviously, there were some holes in his game that created some issues here and there. But, you go back and look at those early games. Yogi started his freshman year, first game, he had 7 assists against Bryant, which, that's certainly not anything to, get terribly excited about. But then his second game, he played 22 minutes, wasn't shooting the ball very well, but was doing a decent job, wasn't turning the ball over that much. But he got, those 3 games before they went out to Brooklyn to play. And when he went to Brooklyn, he played 29 minutes, had 5 assists, only 1 turnover against Georgia. And then in the game against Georgetown,
game winner to put the game in overtime.
Yeah.
His biggest problem, let's not get back into this, but his biggest problem I felt was also, you have to say, a little bit of coaching, because his biggest problem was there were games against Butler that year where basically teams would just let him shoot, and he would shoot us out of games, and he would become more of a shooting guard than a point guard. He would stop distributing, start shooting because guys were leaving him open. And it's when you're 8, that is where a coach has to step in and be like, hey, I don't care if you're wide open. You got to stop. Like, you've got to find a way to get the ball to somebody else. And that was, and it's, again, I have a harder time blaming Yogi. He's 18. He's just coming into this. Like, you need somebody telling you to not do that. But that was always his issue that first year. You're right. When he was doing what he was supposed to do, he was really good. It's just there were those games where teams would lay off him, urge him to shoot, and he would do it.
Yeah.
And he was probably our worst option of shooting on that team.
No, it's an interesting point. And again, the question, Finney's a different type of player.
Yeah.
But how well and how quickly can he adapt to the situation? That'll be an interesting one to keep an eye on. Another question from Jared. Besides the 2 obvious candidates of Devontae and Justin, which non-true freshman do you think is most likely to break out, quote unquote, and make a big jump in production this season?
Non-true freshman. I still think so. Hopefully this fits the bill. I think it's Race Thompson. I know he's a freshman. He's a redshirt freshman, so he's not a true freshman.
He qualifies according to the criteria.
Well, no, because you can't say he's a. Yeah,
I'm saying he qualified. Yeah. I'm saying you're right. Go on, please.
I think it's Race Thompson. I think I've always felt he's kind of a hidden gem we have this year that not a lot of people are talking about. He wasn't just kind of a throw-in recruit. Like, I think he was a 4-star recruit, if not maybe right on the 3 to 4-star level. Like, he was a pretty good recruit, and he redshirted, and he took an entire year to work with this team. Like, this is basically his sophomore year. Obviously, everyone knows what a redshirt is, but for having him being in the program, learning everything, you don't see guys who are that, at that level redshirt a year. So I'm expecting a lot of, I think he's going to come and really impress people. And then it's going to be like, I think we'll be 5 or 10 games in, and it'll be some stories like, oh yeah, we should have seen this coming because he's been on the team for an entire year and he has worked with these guys. He's played with these guys. Like, so that my answer is Race Thompson.
I think that's probably the best answer, especially since Jared decided that we weren't allowed to mention the other players that were, potentially likely figures for that. Here's the thing with Race Thompson. He was a 4-star. He's 6'8", and if there's an area that IU I think is lacking, it's guys that can potentially bang in the post and do stuff down there. Because you want to free Juwan Morgan up to drift outside and shoot. You want to free Juwan Morgan up to move around and do things. We don't know what the disposition of Deron Davis is at this point. And I mean, you got Jake Forrester, who might come in and play right away, or he might redshirt. I mean, we just don't know. Outside of that, I mean, Clifton Moore is 6'10", but we barely saw him last year. He played in 9 games. I've heard very little about him throughout the course of the offseason. And other than that, there's not many people. So I just think by exposure possibilities, it's almost got to be Race Thompson, because
I got one.
What?
I have another one. If you want, I'll throw one out there.
Who?
Who were the two that he excluded off the front?
He excluded. It was Devontae and who was the other one?
Justin Smith.
Yeah, Devontae and Justin Smith.
Okay, I mean, and the question was who's going to impress us most with their improvement. I hate to always go back to everyone kind of always goes back to this, to Oladipo's career, but I will say, like, Oladipo, like, if you look at his sophomore, he made a huge jump from freshman to sophomore. He made a huge jump from sophomore to junior. I could say, if I, again, just having some fun with this question, another possibility could be Juwan Morgan. I mean, Juwan Morgan made a huge jump. I think there's still a level where he could make another level jump. I mean, we've heard great things where he's working out, like, looks great in workouts. If he makes that same, and I think we all, like with Oladipo by his sophomore, you're like, holy crap, this guy's good. And then he came back and it was like, shit, this guy had a 3-point shot. Like he took it to a level where I don't think, like, he was probably the most improved player 2 years in a row. And so I just throw it out there. Like, if Juwan Morgan's the answer, maybe that's the best thing for our team if he takes it to that next level. And I think there's another level he could go to. I mean, and he was great last year, but it's not out of the realm of possibility. He takes it up a complete another notch. I mean, if he adds a couple of, jab steps and adds a 3-point shot, he could take it to that next level too. So I'm not saying that's not my number one answer, but it's an interesting thing to think about.
No, it absolutely is. And I think that obviously the other answer here, if you're just talking about the guys that were on the periphery of the team as opposed to being more in the core, the other answer here would be Al Durham as a possibility. But as we've mentioned, I just think that Race Thompson will have every opportunity to play large minutes because there's going to be a need for that. Whereas I think there's a log jam really at that guard position. Al's going to really have to elevate his game if he wants to get consistent minutes, and that could put a cap on what his effectiveness is. Jared chiming in the chat, he says, I would say either Al or Race, leaning towards Race because of the recruiting pedigree and the need down low with Deron, such a question mark. And then Patrick chimes in with Race supposedly very skilled as well, strong passer, good mid-range. Juwan needs to develop a consistent 3 as well as free throws, which is true. And I mean, those are certainly areas that I'm sure he's worked on throughout the course of the year. I mean, I do, it's worth noting that Juwan Morgan shot 63% from 2 last year. He shot 63.1% from the free throw line. So obviously, even a 10% jump there, that's an extra, probably 15 to 20 points that IU has on the board, and probably more because you would imagine Juwan Morgan's going to be on the receiving end of a lot more contact and probably getting a chance to get to the line a lot more this year.
Yeah.
But I will say this on the Juwan Morgan thing before we move on. He was so good in so many different areas statistically last year. I mean, he was top 200 in offensive rating. He was top 100 in effective field goal percentage. He was almost top 150 in offensive rebounding percentage. He was top 120 in fouls drawn per 40 minutes. He was top 90 in 2-point field goal percentage. I mean, I get what you're saying. The leaps that he would be taking, I guess, would be, I mean, even his turnover rate was awesome. He turned the ball over on less than 13% of possessions, which was, top 300 in the country. If he can develop, better 3-point shooting, he shot 30% last year. Yeah, I could see incremental stuff. He would just have to take a tremendous leap, I think, which is possible, but it would be surprising. compared to some of the other players and the leaps that they would be taking relative to what they were before.
Yeah.
Let's see some other questions as we're kind of winding our way through things here. Another question in the chat. Well, actually, so Brock Haggard brought up an interesting one as well. Don't forget about Evan Fitzner. We could only hope for a Bielfeldt type impact. And that's, it's kind of easy to forget Evan Fitzner because he's not on, a lot of the statistical readouts from last year because he was on a different team. But that is a good point. This is a guy that we don't have much of a benchmark for. When you look at what he did at St. Mary's, he contributed. He was more of a role player. He didn't play that many minutes. He played about 40% of available minutes, shot 40% from three, shot 55% from two. Wasn't much of a distributor, was kind of just more of a spot up shooter. It would be interesting to see how he develops and what his role ends up being. As a 6'10" guy, he's going to come in and be, depending on Deron Davis's disposition, he'll be one of the two tallest players on the team. What will he end up doing with that? He didn't do much rebounding on the offensive end with St. Mary's last year. He did a decent amount of defensive rebounding, but it is something to keep in mind as we move forward.
And it's the fact that he can shoot threes, it does give us the ability to put out some pretty interesting lineups. Like you could have a lineup theoretically for a while of, Deron Davis, Fitzner, Juwan Morgan, Race Thompson, and Romeo Langford. 6'5" and above, and you wouldn't have a ton of ball handling on that, but I mean, Juwan Morgan was able to handle the ball from the top of the post, and Romeo can obviously handle the ball, and again, I don't want to get back in the point guard thing, but that's a kind of an interesting lineup. You have that's like 6'5", 6'8", 6'9", 6'10", and 6'10". I mean, that's a huge lineup that we haven't been able to play in a long time. Or we could run, you could run Finney and Al Durham and Romeo. You could run small. You can run large. And the nice thing with the Fitzner thing is that's not for big guys who have to play in the post. Like you have Deron Davis in the post. Fitzner can be posted out. You could stretch teams and you'd have the ability to get some really tough matchups set up where you'd have to have short guys on Fitzner or tall. There's some really cool things you can do with the lineup.
Jared and I are of similar minds here. He mentions that he doesn't think that Fitzner can equal what Bielfeldt did. He's not the rebounder or defender that Bielfeldt was, but he looks to be as good or better as a shooter. He'll be key, but asking for max impact is tough. And then we were digging into the stats at the same time. I mean, it's hard to overstate how important Max Bielfeldt was to that team in 2016. I mean, he was a top 100 player in the country in offensive rebounding percentage. He came in and immediately became IU's best offensive rebounder.
Yeah.
And you add to that, he was in the top 200 in offensive efficiency. He was, he shot he was 54% from two. He was 45% from three. A much more versatile player, I think, than Fitzner looks to be. And even though he only played, I think probably something like 16, 18 minutes a game over the course of the season, that's more than Fitzner played last year with St. Mary's by a pretty good margin. So that'll be something to keep an eye on, obviously.
From Michigan. That was a stretch where you had to have a grad transfer from Michigan to win the Big Ten.
Exactly. Some other comments here. A question from Brian Tonsoni. Juwan needs to be more perimeter oriented, according to the NBA. He was a beast for us inside. How does this play out? What's best for Indiana? And this is something where I don't foresee a scenario where Juwan Morgan is going to, decide that you're going to pull a Jason Collier and just decide to live from outside. Obviously, he needs to improve his three-point game, but I don't think that NBA scouts are expecting him to just, start jacking threes up every game. I mean, he shot 53 threes last year, so less than two a game over the course of the season. I could see that increasing by a couple, but I think that for Morgan, the idea is hitting the open shot, not necessarily constantly looking for it. So coming in as the trailer, kind of in that Christian Watford type role, being able to follow up the primary offensive break, take a spot on the perimeter and get forgotten about by his defender, who's a post player that's supposed to be going down under the basket. So I don't see. I think everybody knows, in the coaching room and certainly in the locker room that, Morgan's strength and what he brings to the team, not just in terms of his scoring, but in terms of his rebounding, is down low. And the idea that he's going to get dragged out because he needs to work on his NBA bona fides, I think is probably not the case. But we'll have to see. I mean, a lot of it depends on what happens with De'Ron Davis. If De'Ron Davis is back and mobile and fits into the offense, I think it gives Juwan Morgan a lot more flexibility. But I just, to some degree, the fact that we've heard so little about De'Ron Davis up to this point, I do wonder if we should even be counting on him as far as being like an everyday contributor to the basketball team, at least for the first part of the season. Yeah,
it's just a little inside baseball for the CrimsonCast fans. When you talk about that, it reminds me of you and I having a discussion of James Blackman Jr. It always felt like everything he did was then put it on my highlight tape. I felt like he was always just trying to create an NBA highlight tape, that he had one foot in here, but one foot in the NBA. You and I would joke when we go to games together. Every time he did something, I swear he was looking to his dad, mark that down, 14 left in the first half, NBA tape. Anyway,
yeah, no, it is some bad memories, I think, but no. And ultimately, so Joel Wonder asks in the chat if there's any word on De'Ron Davis. I've heard nothing.
Yeah.
I mean,
you bring up an interesting point. The fact that we haven't heard much, and yet we're hearing stories about, Juwan Morgan's killing it. We're hearing a lot of this stuff, and we're not hearing hey, De'Ron Davis is healthy, he's good. And it could be nothing, but there's also you bring up a good point. The fact we haven't heard anything does have to make you wonder for a sec. That's a tough injury to come back from. Maybe he's not going to be fully ready until maybe Big Ten season. And that's why they're not, talking as much about it right now.
There was it's interesting because he had a very cryptic tweet, control what you can control or something like that the other day. And I don't know what that means, but all you can do is hang out and just see. That's a tough injury to come back from. I mean, consider the injury happened, the beginning of January.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not like you can just bounce back from that immediately. It's going to take some time. And, so I think the safe bet right now is just to assume that he's still convalescing and that it's going to take a while for him to round back into shape. But, whether it's December, whether it's January, if it's earlier than that, great. And look, I think that as much as we talked last year about how De'Ron Davis not being in the lineup seemed to suddenly make the offense work better, I look at that as almost a similar scenario to what happened when IU lost James Blackman Jr. in 2016, where it's not necessarily the fault of the individual player as much as it is having fewer personnel ends up equating to a more simplified version of the offense that everybody can more easily handle. And I think that, De'Ron's he's a talented player and he's an interesting wild card as far as, what he brings as far as his skill set. It's a very different sort of skill set from the rest of the people on the roster. How that equates, on the playing surface can be, it can be difficult if you're not used to dealing with it. But once it's out there, I think if, particularly given a whole year of practice, it might end up yielding benefits, but we'll have to wait and see.
And we're in a better spot too. Like we mentioned, Fitzner, Race Thompson, even if they're not at the level we want, even if Fitzner's, half of what Bielefeld was, or he's not what we want. I mean, he's still 6'10". Race Thompson's still 6'10". That was one of the problems last year when Davis went out was, suddenly you had Freddie McSwain who busted his ass and did as best he could, but it's he was 6'7" or 6'5". I mean, you lost all your height immediately. And that is a nice backup we have this year is, even if Race or Fitzner isn't exactly what we, isn't at the highest levels we want, they're still 6'10" and can go out there and give you 10 minutes of being 6'10".
Right. We're rapidly running out of time. Had a couple of questions that I wanted to finish off with. We had one from Patrick. With the looming end of the one and done era, does that help or hurt IU moving forward? Can those schools who have relied on it transition back and maintain success, referring to Duke and Kentucky and Kansas?
Good Gotta say, we missed the one and done era. We didn't really get into that too much.
No, we really did not. Despite having, I think, he had Noah Vonleh, obviously, was kind of the poster child for that at IU. But no, it's interesting.
Eric Gordon.
Eric Gordon.
Cody Zeller could have been if he wanted to.
Yeah. But no, there weren't that many. Look, here's the thing. It's interesting because
Josh Smith, don't ever forget Josh.
Josh Smith wasn't even.
I'm just kidding.
The thing to remember, I guess, as far as the one and done in IU didn't have to be at a disadvantage in the one and done era. They were handicapped, I think, by the fact that Crean struggled mightily in recruiting battles against really highly sought after players. And he went, certainly he grabbed a couple of them, but a lot of the players that were in that one and done mold, IU might end up in the top 5 in the Crean era, but they probably weren't going to end up being, in the final choice. And so I'm curious to see how Archie Miller does on that front. Obviously, he just procured a likely one and done with Romeo Langford, but I think what becomes key here is what is it that makes a college basketball program work? And certainly I think, whenever individual programs are able to amass tremendous amounts of talent, provided they can harness it properly, it can give them a tremendous advantage on the court. We saw that, the 1 year Kentucky won the national title, that was obviously a tremendous team, and it was largely a one and done team. But even the years when they didn't, once they figured it out, they became very, very difficult to beat. Not the following year, I think, but the year after, when they struggled, ended up as an 8 seed, and then made it all the way to the Final Four. That was an illustration of how powerful that can be if you can harness it. It's just very hard to harness it. Like Mike Krzyzewski's tried, he's succeeded, and then he's also failed. Kansas hasn't really succeeded in terms of championships, but they've certainly maintained a level of superiority in their conference. I think here's the thing, like what makes the Archie Miller era, the potential of it so exciting, is how organized Archie Miller seems to be in terms of how he's trying to build his roster, in terms of the players he's going after, in terms of the offers that they're making to players, and the fact that, there's options. And it's not just options like, well, we've got this 5-star we're trying to get, and then we've got these 2 3-stars that are our backup that we'll just try to coach up. Archie's been, he's tapping that next reservoir of players. And I think that if you look at the programs that have been successful that aren't one and done havens, Villanova probably being the best example, what's made Villanova so great over this last 5 or 6 years is how coherent Jay Wright's philosophy is in recruiting, how that translates into how his teams play, how it translates into how the players are developed year over year. And I think you can look at the same thing in North Carolina. You can look at the same thing at a couple of other schools that kind of fit that mold. So I think IU's very well prepared right now for the end of the one and done era. I think that they would have gained a level of, I think they would go up several levels regardless of whether one and done was there or not, because I think there's finally a coherent basketball philosophy in the presence of the head coach here at IU for the first time, really, since the latter stages of the Bob Knight era. And even there, from the recruiting philosophy was just completely jacked up from like 1993 to 1997. It took like 4 or 5 years to get that back on track. So I think, to me, it's coincidental that one and done might be coming to a close here. And I think IU would have been fine regardless.
Yeah.
Anything to add to that, or no?
No, I think here's where I feel like we're on the right path is when you look at the 2019 recruiting board. I'll be really quick on this, but Trace, when you look at, this is something you got me into looking at, and I won't go back to the Crean era as much, but you look at some of the guys that we got who were, people would go nuts over 2 or 3 stars, but it was always look at the schools that we were competing against. And we were competing against like Marist and Texas Southern, and where I feel good is like, I'll just really quickly, Trace Jackson Davis, schools he's looking at: Indiana, Iowa, Michigan State, Purdue, UCLA, Wake Forest. Keon Brooks Jr., Georgetown, Indiana, Iowa, Kentucky, Michigan, Michigan State, North Carolina, Purdue, Texas, UCLA. Brandon Newman, Creighton, DePaul, Indiana, Kansas State, Maryland, Ohio State, Purdue, Xavier, James Boatnight, Connecticut, Indiana, Miami, Florida, VCU, Virginia Tech, Anthony Harris, Cincinnati, Florida, Florida State. I mean, as you know, Indiana, Purdue, Xavier for Armand Flankerlin. I mean, every single person in our 2019 recruiting class. You know, Matthew Hunt is Arizona, Duke, Kansas, Kentucky, Minnesota, Indiana, North Carolina. Every single one of these guys, that's the list of schools. Like, there's not one school in there that is, I would consider, a bad school. And so that's where, no matter how I'm like you, I'm not quite sure how it's going to look when one and done is out, but I feel like we're going to be all right because now we're in the same league as the big boys. Whereas the last couple of years in the past, we weren't recruiting. We weren't playing the same game as the other teams. We weren't recruiting those games. And so I feel comfortable because that's the route we're going down, is that now we are competing at the same level with those. Every program I just listed is where I want us to be at.
All right. Last thing I want to tackle before we finish off, there's a couple of questions we didn't get to. I apologize, but we do know the schedule pretty much. You know, we were still
Tuesday
waiting.
night it'll be announced on the Big Ten Network.
Right. I mean, we don't know the order that the Big Ten games are going to go in, but we know what the order of everything else. So we know that IU starts off with Chicago State, Montana State. I think it's Montana State is next, and then they got Marquette. Then they're at Arkansas. They get Texas Arlington on the 20th of November. There's a week break for Thanksgiving, and then they're at Duke for the ACC Big Ten Challenge. There's a big gap, which will almost certainly be where a couple of Big Ten games will slot in. Then you get Louisville. Then you get Butler in the Crossroads, and then Central Arkansas on the 19th. So, you know, now that we know all of the, you know, and I think Jacksonville's in there somewhere. Now that we know all of the opponents, and, you know, we're going to wait a while before we actually give our commentary on what the record's going to be. But what's your impression overall of this non-conference schedule?
I think it's pretty good. I mean, the nice thing is a lot of the quote unquote, you know, we don't have a lot of those like above 300 and higher ranked KenPom teams. You know, there's, I think, one or two of them are, but, you know, some of those non-conference, like you know, some of those games are against better low level opponents. I mean, I think it's good. You know, I still feel like it would have been nice to have maybe one more marquee game in there, but, you know, we're working on building a schedule. It takes a couple of years to get there, but I think it's good. And the other problem too, that this does go to show, like, this is a bit of a good problem, but we are kind of in, you know, with the Gavitt games, the ACC Big Ten Challenge, with the Crossroad Classics, we got a lot of stuff in the non-conference where we don't have a lot of room to leverage. Like, that's, you know, this is a topic for another time, but that's the thing with the Crossroads, is that's kind of a weekend that a lot of big games happen, and we're kind of tapping ourselves out from that. So while I say I'd like to have more big games, I'm not actually sure where you could place them, because you have, like you said, you have a gap between November 28th and December 8th. We have Big Ten games. And so for me, I think it's about as good as we can get. I think having Louisville in Bloomington is going to be a fun time.
Yeah, look, I think the middle of the schedule for the non-conference has gotten a lot better.
Yeah.
You still got Chicago State. That almost certainly has to be a holdover contract that had to be finished out from the Crean era. And then, you know, the rest of the games that are on the schedule, I mean, there's something decent about all of those teams. And, you know, most of them, I'd have to go back and look and see exactly where they rank with the new projections. But, you know, just kind of going down the list and seeing where everybody was as far as last year was concerned, you're not talking about a lot of chaff here. You know, Texas Arlington, that's a program that's had a decent amount of success over the course of the last few years, and they were, where were they last year? They were 75th in KenPom. You know, they were a team that I think won the regular season title in the Sun Belt, or were very close to winning the regular season. So yeah, they actually did. They won the Sun Belt by 2 games. They ended up losing to Texas State in a bit of a surprise upset, and then they were in the NIT as a 6th seed, and they made it all the way to the 3rd round of that tournament. You know, and you can go through and kind of you can pick out individual factors for a lot of these teams that IU is going to be playing. I don't think that there's, you know, a tremendously bad team on the list. I mean, Montana State's probably the 2nd worst.
Yeah, I mean, and looking at the KenPom from last year, Jacksonville was, you know, above 300, but it's tough. That's off of last year's ranking.
Yeah, well, I mean, again, some of these might have been holdover contracts or things like that, but overall, You know, the
UT Arlington's a good game, and they were 120th in KenPom last year. Like those are the kind of games where you can get a win, but it's going to help you when it comes, time to get in the tournament or seeding in the tournament.
Right. Yeah. Then that's the key ultimately. It's like, it's so much of the problem with the scheduling in the Crean era was that
it was all Jacksonville's.
It was. I mean, it was largely that, and it wasn't even that. I mean, obviously, not getting good games in Assembly Hall was an issue. That's not a problem this year. You get Marquette, you get Louisville. I mean, that's two pretty good teams that the likes of which we haven't really seen that much in Assembly Hall. But even more to the fact, like Crean's scheduling philosophy was that I'm going to go schedule a team that does X well. Like, we're going to schedule a team that's really good three-point shooting, and we're going to work on that in that game and in practice, and that's going to make us better. And, I mean, it's hard to say whether that actually did or didn't, but it missed the forest for the trees. You could schedule that team, but if that team's like 319th in KenPom or in the RPI, that's going to really hurt your strength of schedule, and that's the ticket that gets you in to a higher seed in the NCAA tournament or gets you into the NCAA tournament. And that was the big thing that to me, as a guy that's done bracketology for a long time, was so frustrating about those schedules. People complained a lot about IU in 2016 winning the Big Ten with a 15-3 record and then getting a 5 seed. And it's because their strength of schedule was so bad because they scheduled they had you had Alcorn State and McNeese State and Kennesaw State and Eastern Illinois and Austin Peay. I mean, that's a bad group of games to be going up against. So when I look at it, I say to myself, this is we've seen like incrementally getting better and better. Last year, you had some holdover games against less than ideal competition as far as your strength of schedule is concerned. I feel like they take another step this offseason, and I think we're going to fully see. And I think it's important that it ratchets up as the talent ratchets up too. I think that's an important element to this. I think as Archie gets more confident and gets his players more confident in playing those sorts of games, you end up getting a lot more out of those games. And as Joel points out, Kansas is the model for non-conference scheduling. I think Kansas is a really good example. I think Michigan State is actually a really good example. Like, you look at what Michigan State did. Last year they were in I forget which tournament they were in. But in that tournament, they got to play North Carolina. They got to play DePaul, who was a top 100 team. They got to play UConn, who should have been good, but wasn't. But then they played Notre Dame at home. They played Nebraska. That obviously that was early on in the season and they were in the conference, but but they got decent teams. And then the middle teams that they played, Oakland, Long Beach State, these were teams that were able to compete in their own conferences. And I just think that's such an important point in terms of how you approach things. You're going to vary it every year based upon what your skill level is. But at the end of the day, it's so important because the computers that the NCAA uses to help figure out seeding, that's what they look at. They don't look at, you were working on a particular element of your game plan. No, they look at how good were the teams that you played.
And I'll go off of one thing you just said is interesting. The idea of Archie Miller ratcheting it up as the teams get better, and he's been here longer. I think also too what we have to remember for some of those marquee games, like you look at Kansas and Michigan State, is that it's kind of like a friend that you call up and you invite to go out for a drink. If you invite them 20 times and they keep on saying no, at some time you stop calling them up. Under the Crean era, we were turning down tournaments. We turned down some of these bigger games that I know of. And also we just weren't we weren't worthy of getting those. When you're not making the tournament and you're, a top, bottom team in the Big Ten, like you're not going to be in the classic with North Carolina and Michigan State. Like you're just not in that realm. And so we haven't been worthy of the invite. And then we've had some of the invites we've turned down. And so I do think there is kind of a part too where we have to earn our way back to be at a point where we can get those kind of games given to us as well. So I think on the top end, us to when we see some of these ESPN, classic games, they have, Duke and North Carolina and Michigan State and Kansas playing together. It's like, we have to be realistic with ourselves too. Like we're not there yet, and we're not going to get that call to be invited to it yet. And, we've got to earn our way back in. I think we're maybe a year or two away from getting there. And I feel like this regime will accept those invites as well. But I do feel like we've kind of been, off in the wilderness for the last, 10 years.
I think that's going to wrap it up for us. We went a little longer than I thought, but shorter than last time. So at least we got that going for us. But thanks to everybody for questions and comments. We will be back with more football talk next week, and we'll also probably drop a little bit of basketball in since we'll know the order of the schedule. And we'll be building up towards that opening kickoff, which is less than 2 weeks away now, as IU will be traveling to Miami to take on Florida International University in the first game of the season. Again, thanks to everybody in chat. Thanks to everybody who chimed in on Twitter. If you got questions or comments, please let us know. We are working on the podcast aspect of things. These both should be downloadable at some point here relatively soon. We'll get back to you on that. Just be sure to watch the Twitter feed. So for Scott, I'm Galen. This is CrimsonCast. We will catch you folks on the flip side. So long, everybody.